My screen says live.
Yep.
And I'm looking at a slide.
Cool. My screen tells me it's setting up my meeting for YouTube Live. So.
And I'm looking at a slide.
Me too. Cool. My screen tells me it's setting up my meeting for YouTube Live. Great way to begin.
That can be my introduction.
All right, cool. I've managed to mute ourselves on YouTube, which is, I think, the right thing to do. So, JP and John, thanks for coming back yet again. Only this time, we're opening up the curtains, as we say, and letting anybody who wants to join us live on YouTube come in. Excuse me just a second. Here we are. Good. So welcome not only to the two of you, but this time anybody else who wants to join us. This is, you could say, an extended discussion, and for reasons I think will become clear after a while, it's unlike other discussions that I know about, because it is focused on a project that's a different kind of project than others that I know about. I'm Tom Loughran. I'm a philosopher in the physics department at the University of Notre Dame. They put up with me there. I'm not a physicist. I do STEM education and public outreach and lots of different things. And I've been doing that for a lot of years. Before that, a high school teacher of all sorts. And I am really blessed to be in this project with two nephews of mine, John Loughran and John Rose. They will take the lead some of these times, and that will be especially true the next time when we run open topics. They'll jump in anytime during these, including tonight, but they'll take the lead on our open topic nights, and that will start on our next podcast. So welcome then to the Resurrecting Civility. As you can tell from the cool subtitle, it's processing information socially in the age of AI and COVID-19 gives you a clue as to what we're up to. But tonight, we're going to give a bit more of a clue than that. We'll do just tonight an introduction to the series. You might notice here I call this in as many show and tell indicators as I can, intro, right? 01. Open this first. So anybody who comes into the podcast down the road a little bit and has lost will be directed here, and you'll have just come to the right place. This is the introduction to the series. So we're going to spend a little bit of time in a little meet and greet, and then a little bit of time in show and tell this evening. And I want to set us up for a story. This is a story that John, and JP and John, you've heard before, but I wanted to start again with a story that we discussed a little bit in the past. And then if the podcast is Resurrecting Civility, what exactly is it that's dead, right? What do you mean resurrecting what? Civility is a short answer, but we need a little bit better answer. We'll talk a little bit about that, and our story will help us focus on that. And then finally, we'll look at sort of the purpose of this podcast series, which is not just to talk, but to instill an actionable hope in a new way of thinking about ourselves and a new way of acting in the world. And then we'll talk very last, about what the pattern of life will be as we move from week to week. So, as I said, I'm Tom Loughran. I've been a reader of Alasdair MacIntyre for a lot of years as a professional philosopher, and I sort of grew up reading MacIntyre, grew up professionally, that is, in graduate school. And you'll see a little bit from the story that, or the brief reading that I do tonight, a little bit of how it is that, at least I understand him to see the world. And I see the world that way too. And there's frankly an awful lot of readers of MacIntyre who see the world that way, because he's been writing in public and with pretty big impact for literally 70 years, if you can imagine. He was productive when he was 20 and he's now 90. So that's a little bit about who I am. And I mentioned JP and John will introduce themselves. They'll be with us right along, and they'll take a little bit more time to introduce themselves next time, mostly because I gave them zero warning this time. So sorry, guys. So we recognize what you recognize, those of you who are with us on YouTube. We certainly look around and we see certainly something like a lack of civility, certainly like an increased polarization, certainly confusion about where we get our sources of information from, what's trustworthy, what's not, how we navigate through all of this. How does that equation change when you have very powerful machine learning algorithms and lots of high performance computing and lots of data about us, flinging the world at us in a way designed to catch our attention and keep it, right? These are all features of the world that all of us know something about. You are welcome to be here, whoever it is that you are, wherever you're coming from. The chances are really very good that you're coming at it from a different point of view than I am, that's driving this project, just to speak for myself, a very different point of view. And actually, all of us are coming from pretty different points of view. We may have some things in common. We may have some groups that we trust about certain things. At least we trust them more than others. But wherever you are, I'd invite you to see yourself as sort of coming into a big tent where you sit down and there's a lot of other people here and we're in here for a long discussion. And you are absolutely central to the conversation. Conversations includes you entirely, but so are others, and they're going to be very different than you are. And this conversation is going to try to cater. It won't be able to cater to everybody, but it's going to try to cater to a pretty wide subset of people who might be listening. So you're really welcome. Glad you're here. So let's start with a little bit of a show and tell. This is a picture I took this afternoon from some knickknacks on my bookshelf. Let me just pull them out one at a time. They're pretty cool. Here's one. I'm going to rely on you guys to tell me whether this is visible. Actually, I can do that myself. Yeah, good. So this is cool. It's a little, it's sort of a cube, or it's a little taller than a cube. Technically, it's a three-dimensional object, and it's got something inside. It looks floral. It looks like it's got a stem. It looks like it looks a little ephemeral. This is way cool. I bought this as soon as I saw it. This is a 3D printed object, and it is a 3D print of a flower that was laser scanned on the campus of the University of Notre Dame. So they basically captured in code the position of just where that flower is in a great deal of detail. And then they printed, if you can imagine, little tiny drops of glass everywhere, except in that part of space transposed from where the flower is. And so there's this vacuous flower inside this thing. It's way cool. Additive manufacturing is the cool phrase here. I think a long time ago, people would have been kind of spellbound as to how you get this, right? What the heck is this? Because it's got more fine structure, a little hard to see that in YouTube, but it's got more fine structure than you could get from a mold. Somebody didn't just pour glass around a mold here. That's a great way to make something out of glass, but that's not how they made this. You could imagine it's somebody grew it like a crystal. Although then the question is why the floral pattern, right? As opposed to things we associate with crystal. Good question. It's a beautiful piece of technology. And one interesting thing about it is you can't really tell what the technology is that went into this, not unless you know a lot of background technology in the first place. Beautiful item number one. Here's beautiful item number two. Maybe a little less beautiful, but it's a cool item for which I could use a torch to let you see what this actually is. So here comes my torch. And you ought now to be able to see, and I'll show you exactly what I'm doing here, right? You'll see that there is, in fact, I'll run it the opposite way for a moment without much commentary, right? You can see, again, back here, and now I'm just gonna let it sit for a moment. Oops. Just so your eyes can focus on it. And then you get to see the inside of this piece of technology. And it's not very fancy, right? It's a, I don't know what it looks like here. Not much different. This is just a bunch of fiber optics. You might be able to tell that they're wrapped with a little bit of care, right? Because it turns out that one end, this end, is delivers optical signal to this end. So it's got a cool little University of Notre Dame stamp on it, just to give credit where credit is due. So this is a piece of the CMS detector at CERN, and it's called an optical decoding unit, an ODU. And a bunch of these things sit in big old boxes, about a yard wide and a few inches high and maybe 18 inches deep. And there's lots of these things. This is where signals are processed when they come from the primary scintillating material inside the CMS detector at CERN. Now, some of you listening know exactly what that is. Others may be a little less familiar. You've heard perhaps of the Higgs boson, made the news, even if you didn't follow much particle physics a number of years ago. You heard of the discovery of the Higgs boson, the 5 sigma discovery at the Large Hadron Collider, the LHC. And that basically is an accelerator. It accelerates, in this particular case, protons on protons. It's a proton-proton collider. And these are packs of protons, and there's actually inside these protons, there's a bunch of quarks, and they bring bunches and bunches of these things whizzing past one another, steered by electromagnets, colliding them in collision halls, getting their constituents, quarks on quarks, quarks on gluons, gluons on gluons, to interact with one another. And to produce all kinds of secondary particles, as many kinds of secondary particles as they have energy to produce. They're after rare exotic particles. So this is a high energy. This is high energy physics. And you wrap those things, you wrap those collision points with, you can think of them as big cameras. that are designed not just to capture light, but to capture everything that comes out. And there's a lot of different kinds of things that come out, some number, all the stable things in nature that can be produced come out of there. And there is, in particular, a hadron detector in CMS, hadron, a big barrel detector, outer detectors, et cetera. And this is a piece of that. What this does in particular is sum up each one of these is a particular, every fiber comes from a different spot in the detector. But it turns out you can't afford to keep all that information. It's just too expensive to keep it all. And it would cost you too much computer power. This is just one of the many places where computer power and the expense of the detector limits what you do. And so we add them up. We add up, and we really just want to know, was anything in any of the layers that are stacked on top of each other in a tower? One of those layers is a big piece of brass and then some scintillator, which lights up when a particle passes through it. That's the light that's captured in these photons that end up plugging in right here. And then that happens over and over again. And there's enough layers so that none of the hadrons are going to get out. It's designed so there's just no way they're going to get out. You put as many layers as you have to in order to capture all of the things that could be produced at those energies that are hadrons, that is. These are proton. These are, well, a proton would be such a case. Or a neutron would be a hadron, something inside the nucleus. So this set is a very cool piece. This was designed at the University of Notre Dame by all sorts of folks, faculty, staff. Eventually, high school teachers rolled into this project. I was one of those teachers. It was 21 years ago. And then high school students assembled this. Some of my students were the ones who sort of threaded this through, et cetera, because we had to make hundreds of them, over 500 of them. So if I hadn't told you all that story, this does not tell you either what the heck it is, right? In this case, there's an awful lot of theory on the other side, even though you can see into this thing, and you might be able to guess a little bit more easily how this thing was constructed. You'd have no idea what it was constructed for. So technology is pretty cool that way. And it's a point that we're going to come back to later today, and I would say over and over again as we talk through the things we need to talk through. So that's show and tell. And there will be more of a point to all of this stuff shortly, but I want to drop one more piece in before we start drawing some of those points from what we've seen. This is a piece from Alasdair MacIntyre. The book is called After Virtue, came out in 1981, University of Notre Dame Press. This is just a little bit from chapter 1. Here comes some reading glasses. I'm going to skip around and make this go a little faster. It's about, it's 4.5 pages long if I were to read it all, and I'm going to read less than half of that. So imagine that the natural sciences were to suffer the effects of a great catastrophe. A series of environmental disasters are blamed by the general public on the scientists. Widespread riots occur. Laboratories are burnt down. Physicists are lynched. Books and instruments are destroyed. Finally, a know-nothing political movement takes power and successfully abolishes science teaching in schools and universities, imprisoning and executing the remaining scientists. Later still, there's a reaction against this destructive movement, and enlightened people seek to revive science, though they have largely forgotten what it was. You have to imagine this took a while. But all they possess are fragments, a knowledge of experiments detached from any knowledge of the theoretical context which gave them significance. Here you might imagine a piece of this without an explanation. Parts of theories may be unrelated either to other bits and pieces of theory which they possess or to experiment. Instruments whose uses have been forgotten, have chapters from books, etc. Nonetheless, all these fragments are re-embodied. They're put together in some way in a set of practices which go under the revived names of physics, chemistry, and biology. That's what the pages in the book say. Adults argue with each other about the respective merits of relativity theory, evolutionary theory, and phlogiston theory, although they possess only a very partial knowledge of each. Children learn by heart portions of the periodic table, and they recite the theorems of Euclid, but nobody, or almost nobody, realizes that what they're doing is not natural science in any proper sense at all. For everything they do and say conforms to certain canons of consistency and coherence, and the context, which would be needed to make sense of what they're doing, have been lost, perhaps irretrievably lost. Now, MacIntyre goes on to say that there'd be lots of different theories that float around in this space, some of whom think that you can put these pieces together any way you want, and those are subjectivist theories of science. And then others read that scientists are after truth, and so they pay attention. They think that truth is essential, and somehow subjectivist theories have got to be wrong. And so the debates continue. This imaginary world is very much like the one that some science fiction writers have constructed. Now I'm continuing reading from MacIntyre. We may describe it as a world in which the language of natural science, or at least parts of it, continue to be used, but is in a grave state of disorder. We may notice that if this imaginary world, we may notice that in this imaginary world, if in it analytic philosophy were to flourish, it wouldn't reveal the fact of this disorder. He goes on to explain that analytic philosophy takes apart language as it is, and there'd be language there, and it would not reveal the history. And he goes on to say that phenomenology, existentialism would be in about the same shape. And here he's sort of in a bumper sticker covering the gamut of things that are taught in philosophy departments in the Western world. And then he asks, what's the point of constructing this imaginary world inhabited by fictitious pseudoscientists and real, genuine philosophy? The hypothesis I wish to advance is that in the actual world which we inhabit, the language of morality is in the same state of grave disorder as the language of natural science in the imaginary world. What we possess, if this view, MacIntyre's view, is true, are fragments of a conceptual scheme, parts of which now lack the context from which their significance derived. We have simulacra. I had to look that up the first time I came across it. We have pieces of morality. We continue to use many of the key expressions, but we have very largely, if not entirely, lost our comprehension, both theoretical and practical, of morality. I take it he means, as these folks will have lost it, theoretically and practically, of science. They would have very little idea what science is, and he's suggesting we've lost morality in the same way. Now, he goes on to tell us that we do have some historical resources we could tap. There may be history writing which pays attention to order and disorder, and he cites Hegel and Collingwood there. And he says, perhaps people like that could help us. So maybe we're not completely without resources. But, and now I'll read again, this suggestion immediately brings to mind a crucial difficulty for my hypothesis. For one objection to the view of the imaginary world which I constructed, let alone to my view of the real world, is that the inhabitants of the imaginary world reach a point where they no longer realize the nature of the catastrophe they'd suffered. Yet surely an event of such striking world historical dimensions couldn't have been lost from view, so that it was both erased from memory and unrecoverable from historical records. And if that's the case in our imaginary world, isn't it all the more so in our actual world with regard to morality? If a catastrophe is sufficient to wipe out, right, to, he says, throw the language of practice and morality into grave disorder had occurred, surely we should all know about it. It would be indeed one of the central facts of our history. And yet the argument goes on, history doesn't know about it. Nobody knows about it. Couldn't have happened. Now he defends himself a bit here. He says, well, what we mean by history now is a couple hundred years old, academic history. Suppose, MacIntyre wonders, that this disorder happened before academic history came into place. And suppose academic history embodies the very sort of collapse disorder and can't recognize it because it post-dated the possibility of nearly the possibility of recognizing it. So MacIntyre points out he's kind of up a creek without a paddle at this point. If that's so, right, then what's our way out, right? He doesn't have very much by way of argumentative allies, as he says. May seem to many readers that I've elaborated, that as I have elaborated my initial hypothesis, I have step by step deprived myself of very nearly all possible argumentative allies. But isn't that exactly what is not just this required by the hypothesis itself? For if the hypothesis is true, he continues, it will necessarily appear implausible, since one way of stating part of the hypothesis is precisely to assert that we're in a condition which almost nobody recognizes, and that perhaps nobody at all can recognize fully. And if his hypothesis did seem plausible, it would certainly be false, because he's certainly committed to saying that it would seem implausible. Okay. Last lines, very few. So, he writes, at least if even to entertain this hypothesis, at least if even to entertain this hypothesis puts me into an antagonistic stance, it is a very different antagonistic stance from that of, for example, modern radicalism. He's putting himself at odds with the prevailing culture, even with prevailing academia. That's pretty plain. He's finding fault with modern academic history, for example, right? And if I'm an antagonist, he says, I am, but I'm not like, for example, the way that modern radicals are. And now I continue. For the modern radical is as confident in the moral expression of his stances, and consequently in the assertive uses of the rhetoric of morality, as any conservative has ever been. Whatever else he denounces in our culture, he's certain that it still possesses the moral resources which he requires in order to denounce it. Everything else may be in his eyes in disorder, but the language of morality is in order, just as it is, that he too may be being betrayed by the very language he uses is not a thought available to him. It is the aim of MacIntyre's After Virtue, he writes, it is the aim of this book to make that thought available to him, radicals, liberals, conservatives, everybody alike. One last line. He says, though I want to make it available, that thought available, I can't make it palatable. For if it's true, we're already in a state so disastrous, akin to having lost science. right? We're already in a state so disastrous that there are no large remedies for it. End of MacIntyre. Now, this is 1981. MacIntyre is still writing in 1990, and he said a whole lot more. Some of that will come into our argument, but for now, I wanted to begin with this disquieting suggestion because MacIntyre too, right? In fact, MacIntyre primarily thinks that we have lost something that it is hard for us to even recognize as having lost in our day. And it's very difficult to recognize that, to see that we've ever had it. It's, for example, lost to academic history that we ever lost it. Whatever it is, if it's some cool thing like science, some big and cool thing that it all ought to be compared to modern science, and the loss of it so catastrophic as losing modern science, if it's at all like that, it's going to do a lot of good, and it's going to challenge a lot of assumptions. So what is it exactly that needs resurrecting? That's a question that MacIntyre spends the rest of After Virtue writing, and in fact, quite a number of other books, and so recently as 2016, explaining this to a modern audience. In fact, he spent so much time explaining it that you might wonder whether he's proven his point that you just can't get there from here because he's spent a very long time explaining it. And yet we're still in the same place. If we're not in the same place, that may not be quite fair. We are in very substantial ways not very different than we were when he began writing. I first ran into MacIntyre roughly around this time. In 1980, I ran into MacIntyre, and I ran into him in his Short History of Ethics, in which some of these same theses can be seen there, but not quite so well traced out. So he's been doing this a long time, if you can imagine, making these kinds of points since that time. If he's right, at the very least, history is going to have to be rewritten, right? And morality is, as a matter of fact, lost and needs to be recovered, but needs to be recovered in the way that's quite analogous to recovering science if one lost it. Almost it has to be repeated. It has to be reinvented. It has to be not rediscovered as if you lost it somewhere, right? But reinvented as if you've lost the community of practitioners that held it together. So what needs resurrecting? Let's, like everybody else, we've been talking COVID. We've talked about it a little bit in some of our test podcasts. In fact, I think COVID is such a big intrusion into our life, and it is forcing restructuring, just newly forcing restructuring, surely starting to get us to think hard, right, about what we want to restructuring because we have to, that it's a particularly apt illustration of a need to restructure, particularly apt opportunity, perhaps, for restructuring. And let's think about it. This won't be the last time. Let's think about it on two levels of dysfunction. And I mean to describe these in pretty friendly ways to as broad a set of differing folks as I can. So we get our news from different sources. We trust different people. We have different sets of, we have different skill sets, et cetera. But I think it's the case that though we wouldn't agree about where, we wouldn't identify all the same pieces of dysfunction, I think we can agree that people don't listen to one another very well, share information with one another very well, very trustingly, set down together, assemble an analysis of the situation together well, so that we can operate as on a widespread basis together well. That's certainly the case in a lot of parts of our nation. We throw up protests, right, over somebody puts a policy in place and somebody else puts a protester in place. This is old, it's not new, but it does seem to be heating up in some ways. It's been hot before, and we should not forget, right? 4 dead in Ohio. Some of us grew up hearing, and most of us, you've got to be sort of a classic rock fan to remember that. But that was the riots at Kent State in Ohio, and there were 4 dead who were shot. And what were they doing? Protesting the Vietnam War. They were apparently pretty up in arms about it, right? And lots of things like that, which now are sort of assigned to history. You just don't hear them talked about very much anymore. But we do see fresh instances now. And that is a certain level of dysfunction. But I think you can imagine fixing it. I think you can imagine that people were more patient with one another, that people lingered longer in acquiring skill sets which other people have, skills at asking hard questions about a data set. For example, there are a great many people who know how to do that well. And a lot of those people are on very, very different sides, sometimes even of the same data sets, right? But they don't lack a set of skills that it's very helpful to have if you're going to analyze a set of data. So you could imagine part of our problem is we could just use a bit more education or a bit more application of education as discussions get complex. Part of our problem is we're just impatient. Part of our problem is we're sure that other person's an idiot, right? And we simply write them off. It seems they're a libtard, they're a right-wing nut job, they're a flaming, right? And there's some sort of just drop whatever it is that generates heat more than light into the conversation. And we can imagine conversations without that. We can imagine doing better. I can't tell you exactly how to get there. I actually have a proposal for how we get there. But it's those things that seem to me are a symptom. It's a symptom of working in a kind of resourcelessness. And I think that resourcelessness will, as you better see the resource we're missing, as you better see what needs resurrecting, you'll see more how it might be the case that we avoid those, that we grow in the sorts of ways that we need to fix this first level of conflict, this first level of dysfunction. So many people are quite functional in this space, and some groups are pretty functional. It's just there's lots and lots of groups that aren't, and there's so much information flowing, and all of us often fail. But we can imagine what success looks like. Now imagine that we were succeeding, and imagine it might take us quite a while to get there, but imagine that we really deeply listened to one another, that we worked hard at walking a mile in the other person's shoes, to use the old adage. That one somehow I associate with Abraham Lincoln, and I don't really remember why, right? But all of those sorts of folk wisdom, practically, that we have, we might embody more of that. And if we did, we could imagine what some people sometimes say happened at some time in the past in history. People used to say that people in Congress could actually be friends across parties, could socialize with one another, etc. That's not unbelievably far away. That's mere decades in the past. So we can imagine fixing that in some way. But if we did, and we went back to a time maybe that never existed, but we imagine it, and it existed more so in some of these stories, kind of a Shangri-La, a nice environment where people are genuinely civil, well-informed, courteous and patient in listening to other people's perspectives, etc., and operating just the way that in an informal logic class we could imagine. We could imagine a description of logical fallacies. For example, we learn not to commit them. We do not commit ad hominem arguments, for example, and we deeply listen and respect the positions that comes from others. In that world, what would we do about COVID? That's level 2, or it's starting to uncover it. What would we do about a social problem as profound as this one? How much risk of public health is certain classes of economic prosperity worth? Economic prosperity for whom? Public health risk to whom? Other questions. Just the who and how much applied to a broad range of social goods. And we could ask ourselves, how do we fix that? And you might say, well, capitalism is the best tool we have for distributing goods and services, right? For quantifying them, for putting numbers on them, for informing people, right? In a marketplace that's somehow transparent. Advertising ought to function that way. Truth in advertising, transparency, freedom of information, etc. These are all good. These are all tools that we at least understand in some ways, and they could function well, at least in the abstract. And if they were functioning well, do we have a solution set? Do we have a way of approaching the distribution of goods? I'm proposing that we do not. And it isn't capitalism, is these are political goods, right? What's the right amount of, I don't mean that there are no more free market dimensions here, but capitalism doesn't exactly tell you what laws ought to be in place, does it? Isn't there more of a political craft that ought to be somehow holding in place the free market? So maybe it's democratic capitalism. Does it matter how educated we are? If it did, and we educated everybody really well, would we all of a sudden agree? Or is it just preferences? Are we only left with polite power politics? That might be a pretty nice thing when we look at what we have now, right? But if we fixed our first level of dysfunction and we could engage in civil, respectful, dignified power politics, that would be a certain kind of solution, but it doesn't look like anything like the right answer. It's a very interesting question. What do you do? Grow your group as big and as fast as you can? Get as much money as you can through honest effort in the free market, and then support those political figures who think like you think? And we run that as far and as fast as we can run it. And now you have the question of what would our political systems look like if they were functioning well? Let's imagine fixing level 2 for a moment. Not just with power politics. What I want to suggest right up front here is that what MacIntyre is suggesting is missing. If we restored what was lost on a large scale, we would be not only fixing level 1, but we would be bringing a new resource to level 2. In the same way as you might imagine bringing medicine to a discussion of public health, which could be, you could very well do public health without medicine. Nobody would know very much about it, but you could democratize the whole thing. You could be very kind, very respectful. You could listen to everybody's point of view, right? And you could distribute the goods, the services, et cetera, that you have in some kind of polite power politics. And you know jack about medicine. And you simply wouldn't have an answer to how to put things together because you don't know how the central nervous system works or that we have one. I mean, imagine such a state, right? Then you'd be getting something, right, from your polite power politics, but it would be in many respects the wrong answer. There's a suggestion here that there might be a right answer, at least a better answer, at least a more informed answer when medicine comes to town. And the suggestion that MacIntyre is making is that there's an answer like that for morality, or believe it or not, there used to be. So he says. Of course, if that's right, it's got to be some old religion, and we know all about those, right? Well, we don't know all about them, actually. Not if MacIntyre is right in his description. Not if the way they used to function, and I'm not talking about old-time religion and old-time morality, as MacIntyre says in another place. I'm not just saying that morality is not what it used to be, that we sort of our moral compass has drifted astray. He's saying that what used to be morality isn't anymore. There's no such thing. There's a language of morality, and we use it, but it generates interminable disagreement, including disagreement about whether there's any truth or not. And it occupies a place in our life, but it is not a craft like science. It's not, and now I'm starting to tip a little bit toward what MacIntyre thinks the solution is. Let me drop a third piece into show and tell. This is another little cube, and I'll see if I can set it up so that it looks a little bit better. There you can see there's something inside that cube, and you can see it's thinner at the bottom, and you can see it looks kind of like a tree at the top. In fact, some people call this a beam tree, and there's other names for it too. Just to remind you, these things are a lot alike. They're remarkably a lot alike, but they're made really quite differently. This one is made, as we discussed, through additive manufacturing and highly refined positioning of the outcome. This thing was planned in extraordinary detail and executed with a tremendous amount of precision. I should do my math here. I should have done my math here in advance, but I'm going to say that this thing was executed in a matter of hundredths of a second, probably less. I'd have to calculate the energy of the beam. This was an electron that was fired. It might have been a single electron. I'm not quite sure of the technology here. They certainly dropped this in a beam. In fact, if you can read on the back, you can see just a bit. I'll leave it. Maybe you can't read it on YouTube, but I think it says, if I get it upside down, I may. I did. Try this again. Is that readable, guys? Can't tell. Anyway, I can read it.
I can't read it on my phone, so but
Yeah,
I'm a little hampered by screen.
Sure. Well, it reads SLAC and Fermilab with Sun Microsystems. Oops, they sponsored it. And somebody made it. And this was probably made at SLAC. That's the Stanford Linear Accelerator. It's a linear accelerator, and it fires, I should know this one actually, whether this fires electrons into positrons. That's my guess as to what SLAC is, just from memory. There are such, the Large Electron Positron Collider, LEP, was precisely that. The nice thing about those is that you can fire them, if you can steer those beams right into one another very, very precisely. You can dial up, you know what particle hits what particle, and you can dial up precisely the energy you want, and you can bring into existence things that require precisely that much energy within some range to come into existence. And then those things decay quickly, and they decay at rest, and it's a lot easier to do the analysis. It's in such a lab that this thing was created. And it's not only a beautiful piece, it not only reinforces the point that you really can lose the technology behind the artifact. You can't see the technology behind it, but the technology is nonetheless somehow in there. Were it not for the technology, you would not have that artifact. In this particular case, this is not just an artifact, it's an analog. This is something that was in a certain way self-assembled. Somebody shot at it, you can imagine as if they had a gun. And boom, up popped into existence this beautiful creation. This was literally made in order to show this beautiful creation off. And these are the trails of the cascading particles as that electron ran into electrons around the resin, the various atoms in the resin that this thing is made of. And this whole thing was designed by nature. Isn't it just amazing? This one also was designed by nature, but the information was pulled from nature and was dropped into this thing in a painstakingly careful way, right? This is just the coolest thing. Whereas this one was designed by nature and nobody's code. Somebody had code to steer the beam, but nobody had code to make this happen. This is a self-assembling deal. And if you wanted to draw that kind of very fine structure, and here you could look in and you'd see unbelievably fine structure if you had a better optical device than we have on my laptop. If you looked in there, you can see that nobody could actually have designed that. There's too many little forks in the road. It would have taken too long. Or if that one doesn't convince, there are lots and lots of such cases where you need to create something, you need something to self-assemble because there are too many pieces and the time to and the energy to interact with them is too hard to come by. So maybe you've seen people write with atoms, for example. You've seen the famous IBM written at the atomic level. You ever seen that? It's a cool little thing from IBM Almaden's lab, where they can literally drag atoms around. This is very old technology now, using a scanning tunneling microscope where they basically would grab on to an atom and slightly pull it. You can do that, but you can't build an electronic circuit that way because you'd need to move millions and billions of atoms, and you don't have millions and billions of manual moves that you can put onto something that you need to bake at scale. And so maybe you know that it's an important principle in nanotechnology. Self-assembling monolayers are a big deal. Self-assembly in general is a very big deal, right? You have to, you write it into the DNA and you let it loose on a whole pile of material and it works its way through, sort of like a viral infection. You remember MacIntyre's claim that he can't hope to expect to make his claim palatable, for if it's true, we're already in a state so disastrous that there are no large remedies for it. Well, if he succeeds in making his claim by the time we're done the rest of the book and the rest of everything else he does and all the commentary on it in many, many years, if his claim becomes plausible, were it plausible, we ought to do whatever we can to find a way to get it recovered at large scale. And if there were any way we could do that along a self-assembly model, that's the path we ought to choose. If you could speed up the recovery of science, if you could speed that process up, that's what you ought to do. And that's precisely what this project's about. This project is basically about restoring civility, that very civility which MacIntyre is suggesting in his analogy with science in the text here is more than the kind of civility which we see lacking at level 1 in the COVID discussion. That's lacking, and that's a big problem, and it keeps us from making good decisions. But it's not the only thing that keeps us from making good decisions. It's just the thing that keeps us from recognizing our resourcelessness with respect to good decisions. You could imagine political infighting keeping you from recognizing, you know what, we just don't know jack about medicine, right? That's precisely what needs to be learned. So is there a political craft? And I don't mean a way to get people elected. I mean, is there a craft analogous to medicine that distributes goods, that identifies them and prioritizes them in a way which apparently would have to solve the problem of how to effectively invite all kinds of people from all kinds of perspectives into a collaborative yes? That's a damn big challenge. And that's precisely MacIntyre's challenge, I'm going to go on to say. And it has been done before, MacIntyre went on to write. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And there are resources that are laying dormant, that are not being used in the same way that medicine might not be used in a dysfunctional society that doesn't take the time to look or to tap what medical knowledge is there and just has it drowned out in a democratic cacophony of dysfunction. I don't mean democracy is always dysfunctional at all, but I do mean that it can be. And you could imagine drowning out medicine. In fact, we don't really have to imagine it. We accuse one another of it on the nightly news. Right? The question is, which doctors are we not listening to? Okay. So the purpose then of this whole enterprise, the purpose of this podcast is to instill an actionable hope, which eventually, that actionable hope eventually leads to broad scale practice and to actual generation of political knowledge. This is an exercise in computational politics. It is a new science, a very strange thing to say, but it's a very old thing to say that there's such a thing as a master science. This is precisely what politics was for Aristotle, and it's precisely what many of the medievals picked up, Aquinas notably, only he thought it was theological science that was that master science because he thought his sources of information were from more places than Aristotle thought, because he thought they're in terms of some revelation as well as things for which we need no revelation. My only point is the idea of a master science is not a new idea. The idea that there could be a computational master science is a new idea, in the same way that computational chemistry and computational physics is a new idea. Those are relatively new ideas. The idea that you could do that in a self-assembling sort of way is, maybe it's a new idea, or at least it's a crazy idea that if you could do it, you ought to try. And there are resources that we are now in an embarrassment of resources laying around. Look, for example, at the resources that have brought, look at the revolution in, let's say, genetics, or take your pick. Look what's happened in the last 100 years in these various sciences. What, we discovered DNA. That was important, right? We're on the threshold of individualized medicine because some graduate student realized that PCR is a thing. If we haven't talked about PCR, the three of us, we certainly haven't in this first broadcast. Someday we'll do it in another one. PCR is a wonderful thing. It's an algorithm for turning tiny little bits of DNA into very large amounts of DNA really fast. It's the coolest thing. It's an algorithm. It's a heating, cooling, catalyzing algorithm. It reminds me of the structure, if you've ever taken apart. My daughter Katie rides a motorcycle. She's shown me the gears and marveled at the transmission and the way that various strategies at work. It's an algorithm in steel. It's a beautiful thing, right? The way that you shift gears from one to another, the way they economize, the way they keep heat down, the way, et cetera. It's a beautiful work of engineering. That's what PCR is. Those things have happened and have blown out of the water what science could do 100 years ago. Brand new technology radically changes things. We have brand new information processing capabilities. And AI is a two-letter word we use to throw at them sometimes, but machine learning is a slightly better phrase to throw at them these days because we kind of know what we mean by machine learning. AI is sort of whatever somebody thought couldn't be done as some smart person quipped. As soon as you can do it, it's not AI anymore, right? AI is always the next thing in the future, but it's just computing getting better and better. But machine learning is a particular thing, and you can imagine tapping it, and you don't have to imagine it because it's already operating on us every day. In fact, it's operating in YouTube. In fact, if you're not one of the three of us who started this conversation, it operated on you in YouTube, and that's why you're here. Now, that may not be true if there's a handful of people who are here, but if you ever see that there's 100 people listening, guaranteed the algorithm went and got you. And that's a brand new thing. And so the whole idea, I'm old enough to remember being called Web 2.0. The new web. The new web is really now just the internet, lost back in history. But it was the idea that maybe you didn't have to be a coder yourself. Maybe ordinary users could generate content and put it into the digital world. What a wild idea, right? And now we take it utterly for granted, right? It's the air we breathe. That's a new thing. These are incredibly important technologies, and they have not been tapped for this purpose. So can we do computational politics in a new way? That's the question. Now, I'm not the only nut thinking about this. There are other nuts too. We'll look at one of them, not just a nut, but we'll look at Sandy Pentland's work. And he's thinking about it in a big way. He's not just thinking about it. He's revolutionizing a new deal in data, as he puts it. He's working at the highest levels of international data policy. GDPR, for example, is among the kind of formative conversations he's been part of. Imagine cell phone data from an entire nation, anonymized, right, and put to service. Those kinds of things are the kinds of things that Sandy Pentland has access to in what he calls a new science, and he calls it social physics. And he's getting close to politics. He's getting close to computational politics. He flirts with it, but he doesn't have enough of the pieces for computational politics. But there are many, many other pieces that are out there. and we're going to bring them together, and we're going to see what we can make. So when we do that, we will end up with a new way of looking at ourselves. I'm going to leverage the information processing paradigm. It's a great processing. It's a great paradigm. It's the way we now think about the brain. We don't always think about it as an information processor or as a computer, but we kind of do now quite often. You might think of it in other terms. Someday in the future, I wonder whether we might think of the brain as a community, but we'll have to get to that. There's some reasons for wondering whether that might be so. But in any case, we think of it as a computer. So let's leverage that paradigm. People use it all over the place. Imagine that we lived in an environment in which we parallel processed in communities of people like us, more or less like us, people whom we trusted well, call those rich communities. They're rich because they parallel process from a relatively homogeneous point of view, and they bring in a lot of answers. And they share those answers with one another, of course, only answers from a certain perspective, but they parallel process it tremendously. You need trust to parallel process, right? You can let your spouse go to your kids' parent-teachers meeting if you're not there, and she'll come home and she'll look out because presumably you have something in common, right? You understand this child, you love this child, you have so much in common, you can parallel process that activity. You wouldn't let just any stranger go there. You have no idea, right? For a whole variety of reasons. Maybe that's not the best example. Pop to mind. Parallel processing requires a certain kind of commonality. You have to play nicely to parallel process information. You could imagine that. We'll dive into it. That's a rich community. But now let's imagine that we also exchanged information from one parallel processing community to another. This is precisely what we do so poorly now, right? We are very, very bad at it. In fact, we're threatened by the alternatives quite often, and we're certain. In fact, we use the phrase, everything I needed to know, I heard when. All you need to know is, right? And those are, and then after the is, drop in something which makes that person plainly not one of us, plainly somebody you ought to distrust. Boom, conversation over. We're not very good at processing information from one community to another. We need to figure out how to get better at that. And if we had a high information flow of rich communities, we might imagine ourselves in this level one sort of civility, where we've overcome a lot of challenges and we are in some ways civil and can begin to process questions, maybe put aside some less well-informed perspectives. Maybe they drop out when they become a little bit better informed, right? And we have a little bit more patience for that. And you might imagine you're starting to whittle down, but you still fundamentally don't have a science of it. You're just happier with yourselves and you make less bad decisions in that state of affairs. You could have a high information flow network, and you need something more than that. And there is something more than that available. And MacIntyre knows what it is, and we're going to know what it is too soon. So what we're going to do is something like defining a new sport. It's a new game. It's an information processing exchange. It's a new sport. And we're going to build a league for it, starting with at least describing what a team looks like, what a league looks like, and then eventually perhaps putting a team together and inviting others to put a team together. Or to use another analogy, we're going to do something like lay out a blueprint for a new way of living together. Think of it like a new town with a new infrastructure. And we're going to point out what it is to build. What are the things that buildings have to tie into this infrastructure? And where might you build them? And then we're going to build one as an example. Maybe people like that building. Maybe they want to build another one of their own. This is a little bit like designing a new social motherboard, where social information processing is done in a different way. You could imagine using GPUs rather than CPUs for certain kinds of processing. You don't need to imagine it if you know anything about it. If you're processing a lot of graphics, for example, you drop in graphic processing units. They were designed for that. Lots of other things. There's different ways to process information, and you've got to take into account what are the various sources, what are the various kinds, what's the various flow rates, et cetera. And I need to optimize a configuration to make that all work well. We're going to do that. So, sorry, jumped a tiny bit ahead. So we're going to learn not only what it is to build such a network, such a network looks like, but how do you start building one? And it turns out you can start building from all kinds of different places. And we are remarkably rich in resources for starting to build the kinds of communities that we need. And we can build them all over the place, and we'll say why and how. So this is a new way to think about and address a lot of the central challenges of our time. If we've already imagined just a little bit the analog to medicine with regard to social goods, written more broadly, that if you had it, if you could build it, if you could start to get there, and you could start to accelerate the process of getting there, if you could create a new science, new living laboratories, that's Sandy Pentland's phrase, I think, not mine. If you could do all of that, and we might be able to move much more quickly toward recapturing what MacIntyre thinks is lost. We would have perhaps a new foundation in that. We'd have to have a new foundation if we thought of ourselves in a new way, foretelling our old stories. We would have to understand ourselves as no longer what we used to think we were, or still what we used to think we were, but in a new way. And we'll do that. So finally, how are we going to do it day after day, week after week? Well, we're going to stay at it for a couple of months, and we're going to do a sort of a medium resolution pass. We're going to take, maybe it's 30, maybe it's 40, maybe it's 50. It's not probably more than that. Pass, we're going to drop 50 supports, something like that. You need a lot more, but you can put a building up on 50, something like that. Maybe 50 is not quite the right number. That's the right order of magnitude. That's what I mean by medium resolution pass. This will take us months, but not a lot of months. We're going to run 3 days a week for 60 to 90 minutes. And on the first and the third, generally Monday and Friday, not quite so this week, we're going to do some sort of heavy project lifts. And I have to apologize. This was a very heavy project lift. And you heard me until you're sick of me. It ought to be a little bit more of a dialogue. It ought to change pace a little bit more. We will change pace, certainly in an open topic session on the second day of the week. A discussion of, they might be current challenges, current opportunities, questions, whatever it is, whatever people are thinking about on day 2. And as we move forward, and this has yet to be built out, and it's the last thing I'll say today. If you've made it to this introduction, you've just gone through a lot, but you have some idea now where it is we're heading. And if you've joined later, and we're talking to folks not now live, but people were swinging back in, still find that a fascinating thing to do in time and space, right? Is to sort of greet people from the future, right? Who are going to plug right in here. When we do that, when you plug right in later and not now, we'll do our best to leave behind a trail. Back in the old days, they used to call those breadcrumbs, and leaving behind a little trail, say in a wiki, so that you can find your way back. Times have changed, but we'll leave something like a trail for other people to jump in and to catch up if they want, so they can say, what the heck are these guys talking about on day 24? That's it. That's resurrecting civility. That's what we're going to do for the next few months. John, thanks for your patience. Normally I let you in a little bit. This time you just smiled at me, and I'm grateful we've spent, this is day 10 for us, and it's day 1 for everybody else. So thanks for being around. Thanks for imagining this project, for participating in as well as you have and as well as you're about to. With that, I think we're done.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks. Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Bet. I'll get with you both offline a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit about today's Tuesday, about Thursday, and we'll be back at it, and you guys will be playing a different role then than you played here. So thanks for being good listeners.
Of course.
All right. Thanks very much. Thanks for joining us. Whether you joined us live now, I think probably the chances of that are 0. But you will swing back into the space and join us in the future. And I sure appreciate you coming with us too. Thanks. We're out. And I will say goodbye on the YouTube side of it.